Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Disafimi History with your host, Wendy Aris. Today, we've got a fantastic episode lined up. Wendy will be sitting down with Professor Randy Brown, who is an award-winning historian of Atlantic slavery, who specializes in the British Caribbean. He is the author of The Driver's Story, Labor and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, 2024, and Surviving Slavery in the British Caribbean, 2017, which received the biennial Elsa Gouveia Book Prize from the Association of Caribbean Historians. Randy is Professor of History and Director of First-Year Seminar at Xavier University. In this episode, they'll be discussing the article, Husbands and Fathers, the Family Experience of Enslaved Men, in Berbice, 1819 to 1834. So settle in, and let's get into the conversation.
I wanted to thank you so much, Professor Brown, for coming on to the podcast, Disafimi History, to speak about your article that I reached out to you about because it was about husband and fathers, the family experience of enslaved men in Berbice, 1819 to 1834. And again, a topic that's not really discussed that much, but I do appreciate you for coming on to the podcast and to be able to speak about this. But before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I was pleased to hear from you, and it's a nice opportunity to chat with you and your listeners. My name is Randy Brown. I'm a professor of history at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. I've been here about 13 years now. I work mainly on the history of slavery in the Caribbean and a bit on the transatlantic slave trade. My first book was Surviving Slavery in the British Caribbean. That focused on the problem of survival in Berbice, part of what's now Guyana. A second book came out a bit more recently, last year. It's called The Driver's Story. It's about enslaved drivers in the Caribbean, fairly heavily invested in the Guyanas, similar to my first book, but looking a bit more broadly. So I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. Thank you so much. And then we'll start. So, what inspired your research into the family roles of enslaved men in Berbice during this period?
Yeah, this piece came out of really my first book, which was focused on Berbice. I was really deeply interested in some of the records that came from Berbice, which I think we'll talk about pretty soon, hopefully. And I was really interested in the problem of survival and how enslaved people tried to survive, both in the literal sense, in terms of prolonging their life under slavery, and in terms of more broadly coping, emotionally coping, kind of culturally, like what it meant to try to carve out some semblance of a viable life under slavery. I knew, or at least had a hunch from the work of other scholars, that family was going to be key to that. And I kept seeing that in the records and the documents that I was looking through, where enslaved people really foregrounded family life. But one thing I started noticing that it wasn't only rather enslaved women. A lot of the work that historians had done up to then, and even now, had really focused on enslaved women as mothers and their role, their experiences of motherhood, of sexual violence, sexual abuse. And I started noticing that there was a lot of records of enslaved men as husbands, as fathers, that marriage really mattered to them, that raising children mattered, that forming families, different sizes and shapes mattered. And so I wanted to explore those experiences and see what it might look like to try to kind of center enslaved men in addition to enslaved women when we looked at family life under slavery.
No, that's great because, again, men, just as you said, are not necessarily at the forefront. It's mostly just going to look at a lot of women. But again, in certain record types, you'll see them more often than not. I know that in Jamaica, you'll definitely see them a lot more prevalent in the manumission records. as
Mhm.
opposed to anything else. And then for you, I guess, how did the enslaved men, in terms of, navigate their roles as husbands and fathers within the constraints of slavery?
So any sort of family life under slavery was incredibly difficult. You find challenges and obstacles, and really even those words kind of fail to get it just how dire it was. In terms of family formation, right? Rates were extraordinarily low. Infant mortality was extremely high. Mortality for anybody was extremely high. Families were routinely broken up when mothers were sold apart from their children. Same thing for fathers. When marriages were broken up and people were moved elsewhere. And so family life is kind of constantly in flux and traumatic. Um, for enslaved men, there was an added challenge in many places. This is certainly true in the case of Berbice in the early 19th century, and that's a demographic challenge that sex ratios were uneven. In any societies in the Caribbean that were importing large numbers of African captives, in the transatlantic slave trade, men outnumbered women pretty significantly. And these change over time and place, but in general, there were many more men than there were women, which meant that most men really had very little chance of forming any sort of permanent partnership or lasting connection with enslaved women. There's a lot of male rivalries, as it were, for relatively scarce women. And of course, white men are monopolizing lots of enslaved women, claiming them as so-called housekeepers or concubines, and of course, outright sexually abusing them. And so there are all these challenges that enslaved people in general face. They're kind of special challenges, gender challenges for men and women. And in spite of all that, though, men actively sought marriages and partnerships with women. They wanted to build families. And they did. They tried to influence the direction of those families as well. Kind of aspiring to be, to the extent they could, and there are severe limits on this, I want to emphasize, to be patriarchs, to exercise a degree of authority over their dependents, which for them meant their wives and their children. They tried to protect their family members from different types of abuse, both from other enslaved people and even from their enslavers. They shared their limited resources with them, rations or so-called allowances of food, for example. Sometimes they even appealed to legal authorities, like in the case of Guyana, the protector of slaves, for redress. And so what I found is family life really mattered to enslaved men, although it was incredibly difficult to form the families in the first place, to keep families together, and then to try to kind of exercise to be the types of husbands and fathers that they wanted to be.
No, and then this goes into my next question in terms of, with these enslaved marriages and family bonds, were they recognized and or respected by, of course, the plantation owners and of course the colonial authorities?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a tricky answer because on the one hand, no, planters and enslavers were indifferent, were kind of callously indifferent to enslaved people's family lives, to their family ties. They separated families by sale. They're generally not respecting, for example, a father's kind of assumption that could be able to protect his descendants or his dependents rather. Um, this is especially true in the case of Berbice before 1826, when there's the colony's first comprehensive slave code is passed, and that does offer a series of explicit legal protections to enslaved families. This is part of a whole larger project of imperial reform known as amelioration, to kind of better regulate the treatment of enslaved people. Um, just for example, that code prohibited separating legally married couples by sale or parents from their children who are under 16. Um, on the other hand, and then these things are regularly violated, and we know this because enslaved people are going to court to say, "Hey, I'm being separated and I shouldn't be," right? "Hey, I'm being sold apart and I have a legal right to this." So they're highly aware of their legal rights, and they're trying to enforce them. On the other hand, there's a lot of evidence that even enslavers recognized enslaved people's family ties, even in the absence of formally registered marriages, which was really the exception. Very few people, even once they get the legal right to marry, go through the process of converting to Christianity, of getting the marriage solemnized by a minister, and getting legally registered. It's just very low rates of legal marriage. That doesn't mean that people aren't together or that they're recognized. And so one way you see this is looking at the series of evidence called the slave registration returns. These were essentially census records of enslaved people in the early 19th century British Caribbean. And one of the things you see, not all of them, but many of them, planners are listing enslaved people in family groups. And so they're kind of literally drawing connections to say, hey, this man and this wife are married, and then here are their descendants. And so there is a kind of de facto recognition that enslaved people did live in family groups, that they were married, that they had connections to their children. Of course, without much legal standing, there's very little enslaved people can do. And so it's a kind of long and complicated answer to your question.
No, no, absolutely. That's fine because again, you're looking it tended to depend on the plantation owner and how they were and how they wanted to perceive things. But when you mention about the slave code, goes into my next question, of course, of how common was the forced separation of enslaved men from their partners and of course their children and babies.
Yeah, that's a really tough one to answer because we just don't have the types of records that would provide that sort of statistic. You would need to do kind of extraordinary demographic work and trace people across different plantations. And so, while I can't say X number of families were separated or this is how common it was, what I can say is my sense is it was very common to separate families by sale. In the case, and again, every colony and this changes over time as well. In Berbice in the early 19th century, one of the things that was happening is that the slave population is declining, not only through so-called natural decrease, that is, rates of death rates are outpacing birth rates, but because there's this big transfer collectively of enslaved people from Berbice to neighboring Demerara. Sugar production is really expanding in Demerara, and Berbice kind of expands rapidly for the first couple decades, and then it starts to decline in terms of plantation production. And what you see is planters going bankrupt, they're over mortgaged, they've invested really heavily. And what this means for enslaved people is they're often getting sold, sometimes in kind of large units, sometimes ad hoc individuals, maybe in small groups, from Berbice to Demerara, moved 100 plus miles away. And there's really no legal protection. Again, that 1826 slave code did prohibit separation by sale. So in theory, it should have become less common over time. Again, what the enforcement mechanism, all of this relies on an enslaved person to know they have legal protections, to physically get away from the plantation and go and lodge a complaint, to have enough evidence to persuade legal officials that what they're saying is true. So planners are trying to get away with whatever they can, and basically violate enslaved people's rights to keep their families together or anything else. Enslaved people push back, but with limited success. And so I don't have a sense of exactly how common it was, but I think it continued to be very common, even when it should have stopped, at least for legally married people, um, after 1826. I think it continued.
No, probably. And I guess with the records that you were able to see, were you able to ever uncover any forms of resistance by the enslaved men to prevent the breakup of their families? Like, was anything recorded that you were to find?
Yeah, I mean, fragmentary glimpses is what we get, but they're revealing to me. I mean, there are a couple ways enslaved men tried to keep their families together. In some cases, they knew that they were going to be sold, and they appealed directly to the plantation manager, or if it's a resident planter, rather than an absentee owner, appeal to them directly and say, "Hey, I'm not going to be sold without my wife and children." Again, there's very, very little power to do that. In some cases, though, and I'm thinking, for example, of a head driver who is sold, and he's drivers in general, these are enslaved men or in this supervisory managerial position. They're valued very much for their managerial skill, the authority they have. And he seems to leverage that and say, I'm not going to be sold without my wife and children. And what's remarkable is not that he says that or not that he objects, but that the seller and the buyer agree and say, okay, we'll buy the family together. Now, I don't want to make too much of that. I think that is the exception to what's going on. We also see enslaved men going to court when they're often what happens is they are either sold away from their plantation, which means away from their wife, or their wife is sold away from the plantation, and they go and object. What happens in the vast majority of those cases is legal officials say, I have no power to compel you to be sold together. Again, this is especially true before the right to legal marriage exists in 1826, where legal officials and planners say, yeah, you recognize one another as husband and wife, but um, and this may be distasteful. They may say, "Oh, we're kind of hand-wringing. Oh, this is really sad. We understand the complaint, but tough. There's no legal protection for this." Since they've been clearly valued these marital and kinship relations, but they didn't have a whole lot of power to maintain them.
Yeah, and then of course the records are just very sparse in terms of what is available to
Yeah,
view all
yeah,
this stuff, right? So
yeah.
And I guess, I guess this kind of leads, and this might be a challenging question, is, were there any, I guess, spaces or moments of respite where enslaved men could engage with their partners or in children?
That is one of the hardest spaces to try to see into, to get a window into. I mean, like all people, enslaved people, of course, carved out moments of intimacy, of privacy, moments where they're away from labor. I mean, they're trapped on what are essentially forced labor camps, right? So on the one hand, there's no escape from work for the kind of overarching crushing power of the plantation regime, and yet they had private houses, they had private spaces. The nature of the evidence makes it really difficult to see what that might have looked like. So presumably, yeah, fathers took their children to teach them how to fish or how to catch crabs in the rivers and creeks that lined the plantations. Mothers taught their daughters how to prepare food, how to mend clothes. Husbands and wives must have had the sort of kind of quiet conversations right before sun rose, and they had to go to work. This is for people who may have lived together. But we know very little about them. Part of the reason is the nature of the evidence. It tends to be enslavers. And even when we have enslaved people's testimony in the legal records, the legal process itself, the process of making a legal complaint, filters the types of things people say, right? They go to legal officials and complain when a legal right has been violated or when they think they have some legal standing. And so they're often not talking for a variety of reasons, in addition to those, about these kind of more private, intimate moments. We know more about the kind of public holidays, ceremonies, and celebrations, things like Christmas and New Year's, where enslaved people were given a really rare and brief time away from work to celebrate, to gather, to travel from one plantation to another, to dance, to feast, and presumably, right, family groups might have carved out time there. I mean, so those are the kind of spaces I imagine this happening in. Burials and funeral ceremonies, again, where people come together to mourn and support one another. But we see relatively little in terms of kind of detailed descriptions about those private lives. But that's at least where my imagination goes. But for historians, it's really difficult to see into those spaces and moments.
Mhm. No, absolutely. And I guess that's what we have to infer in terms of what we see and kind of guess or trying to transplant what we do modern day and what could have been. Um,
Yeah, and the novel, this is where the novelists are great. Like I mean, in teaching, I love to teach, obviously I teach lots of primary sources and I teach scholarship, but I like to teach novels too, because they're not bound by the constraints of the archival record in the way that historians are. I mean, I'm really comfortable speculating and talking about what might have been, what could have been in my own writing. But of course, we've got to say, hey, we're imagining this could have been, right? Novelists don't have to do that. So you read something like, I don't know, I think Marlon James's Book of Night Women is one of, I think, the single best treatments of Caribbean slavery. He can go into a whole world informed by the scholarship, informed by what he knows, but then imagine what might have been.
And that's the advantage of writing a fictional historical
Yeah.
record. That's the advantage. And so I guess, in terms of I don't know if you were able to find, I guess, any examples of enslaved men forming, I guess, surrogate or extended family networks when biological family members were absent.
Yeah, I mean this so I think we start with the context here.
Yeah.
It's a world where people are constantly dying. Uh,
Hmm.
People are just saturated by like most if you pick an adult enslaved man, many of the people he's known throughout his life, have died or will die fairly soon. I mean, it was just I think it's hard for us to imagine sometimes what that world was like where people were just surrounded by death. And as we talked about earlier, families are being broken up by sale. It's also a world where parents are spending most of the day working away from their children, even very, very young children. And so there's a huge need for kind of alternative caretakers, from aunts and uncles and cousins, and we put scare quotes around those because those may not have been actual blood aunts and uncles, to all sorts of other arrangements. One of the more interesting ones that we see in the Caribbean has to do with this notion of shipmates. This is a term that really comes out of the Middle Passage. From the very beginning of enslavement and sale on the African coast, people were ripped apart from their communities and families. And they face this problem of just incredible disruption and alienation of kinship ties. And one response to that, I mean, there's a lot of responses to that, but one of them is to try to look for new forms of attachment and belonging, new relationships. And in some cases, that's going to mean forming families and marriages, but it also means these shipmate bonds, which are so much deeper than friendship. It's really a thing that's particular to the African diaspora. One thing I've struck by is that people remember these shipmate ties and support one another decades after the Middle Passage, that they continue to call one another my shipmate. That's how they identify. And so to me, that's maybe the one of those, I don't know, most striking examples of kind of alternative, or sometimes it's called fictive kinship. I don't really like the fictive term. I don't think there's anything fictive about it just because it's not blood relationship. Presumably there were lots of other or similar or parallel relationships and terms that people had that again they're not really sharing with planners or don't get captured in the types of evidence we see. But clearly people are not only raising and caring for their individual kind of nuclear families in the way that we maybe might think, at least in, I don't know, contemporary United States or Canada.
No, definitely. And I guess it kind of leads into, I guess, the African cultural traditions and
Mhm.
practices. Would you say that that influenced certain these formation of family bonds amongst enslaved men and women?
Absolutely, absolutely. And and Caribbean slave societies, you're talking the vast majority of people are either born in Africa or they're a generation or maybe two removed from their African homelands. Um, and so they're bringing with them a whole host of ideas and assumptions about what family should look like, how, sons should behave, how mothers and fathers, what the relationships between them. So they're bringing all that with them. Of course, they're in a very, very different society, and that's immediately apparent to them, right? Living on a plantation in the Caribbean is very different, even if you're surrounded by other African descended people, than living under any type of freedom in Africa in the same time period. One of the most striking things I found when it comes to enslaved men and their roles as husbands and fathers, especially, was the extent that they're trying to recreate something that was known in Africa as big man politics. They aspired to be what was known as big men, both at the time and even since. This comes into more contemporary. Again, I'm not a I'm not an Africanist at all, and I'm certainly not a specialist in modern Africa, but there's a term that resonates. It has to do with this idea of related ideas, wealth in people, which is something that anthropologists and other scholars who worked in Africa have talked about. And it's something that cuts across a wide swath of African societies, which had their own ideas about politics, whether stateless or centralized. And so this is a kind of very broad common denominator at the most basic idea where people see wealth not largely in terms of material wealth or capital, but in terms of recruiting and retaining followers. It's kind of, again, a catch-all term, especially women in exchange for offering those followers scarce resources and a modicum of protection. And so that's one kind of model that everybody's bringing with them into the Caribbean is an idea about how men should behave as leaders and as fathers and husbands. Now, not all enslaved men, even those who aspired to form these large families, had the same success. I found that artisans and especially drivers, relatively so-called elite enslaved men who are really stand out in terms of their social and political authority and their kind of moderately better material circumstances, they're way more successful than other men. They're way more likely to be married. And the demographics, the statistical records we have, show this. When they are married, they have larger numbers of children than other enslaved men. And to me, the most striking thing of all, they're some of the only men who form polygamous marriages, that is, men who had multiple wives. And this is something that African men wanted, but is extremely difficult in the face of the demographic differences we talked about earlier. There already is a kind of numerical scarcity of women that men are competing for. Drivers stand out in being more able to offer their dependents access to resources, to protection. They're arguably more attractive partners. Um, Again, there's an inherent tension in being an enslaved man and being a big man, right? You're supposed to be a leader, you're supposed to have power, and there's lots of things that enslaved men simply can't do, right? You can't keep your family together, you can't always protect them. I was reminded of this again and again when reading about enslaved men's failed efforts to protect their daughters and their wives from sexual abuse and violence. Men who go to legal authorities and say, the planner is sexually assaulting my wife and I can't do anything about it. Um, and yet there are, I mean, trying to recreate at least some semblance of big man politics under Caribbean slavery.
No, that term big man is definitely something that is used significantly, I think, throughout the Caribbean. But
Yeah, I mean the very term. I mean, it echoes into today. I mean, it's interesting that it's. I had one reader once saying, "Oh, you're using this term, but it's kind of anachronistic." But it actually shows up in the primary sources from the early 19th century. So, "Oh, he was a big man," or "Oh, I gathered here with other big men." And so, this is a term that, at least in the Anglophone Caribbean, has existed for a couple centuries and seems to be really coming from West and Central Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And enslaved people are using it too. It's not just projected on them by scholars or even by planners, but it's a term that people recognize, they know what it means.
Mm-hmm.
At least then and now. Not that the meaning doesn't change, but yeah, I'm like you mentioned, I'm interested in the kind of ways that it's persisted into the present.
Yeah, definitely. And I know maybe this can't be addressed, but I guess with the constant threat of, separation or punishment, how this affected, the emotional well-being of the enslaved fathers and, of course, husbands.
Yeah, um, the records don't tend to concentrate and certainly don't dwell on the emotional issues at stake, which is incredibly frustrating. Like some of the things we most want to know about enslaved people's experiences
Mm.
we don't know about, but we do get some glimpses. And not surprisingly, enslaved men found it deeply troubling to not be able to offer their wives and daughters the kind of protection they wanted, that they wanted to, especially when it came to physical or sexual violence from white men. The separation I see less of, and I don't think that's because it was less troubling, just because um, the complaints really focus on the kind of narrow issue of whether they can or can't be separated. I did come across a lot of complaints, though, where men are anguished by the abuse that their family members have suffered. I mean, there's a case that always has stuck with me of a man named Felix who goes to complain that the manager has been essentially, he says, taking, but it's serially raping his wife and the wives of other enslaved women, even though he already has a woman he's claimed as his. Um, and again, he goes and complains, and legal officials say, well, that's really kind of distasteful, but there's really nothing we can do because it's not illegal.
Mm.
And so to kind of imagine what that must have felt like, right? To take that risk. And again, it's a huge risk to go and complain against your enslaver. We know that they often, there's retribution for doing that.
Mhm.
An even more disturbing case for me that was really hard to write about and to come back and think about involves an enslaved man and an enslaved woman who have a daughter who's recorded as 11 or 12 in the records. And the plantation manager rapes her and then she dies as a result of her injuries. They're absolutely devastated. I mean, what parent wouldn't be? And so they take the again really dangerous step of going to the colony's highest legal official, the fiscal, for redress, seeking justice for their daughter. Um, and they don't get any. They don't find any. There's some narrow, kind of, to me, very obvious, cover up that no, she died from some other medical reason, that it has nothing to do with the sexual violence she suffered. Um, and we have to kind of imagine from very sparse information. All that's recorded here, I think, is something, and I'm paraphrasing rather than verbatim, says, this man Felix, he did not, or Telemachus, he did not want to hear it. They're trying to explain to him what they see as the real cause, and he says he didn't want to hear it and had to be carried away. So to me, that has a father who's screaming or crying or both. As a parent myself, like I mean, to try to even imagine what those moments would have looked like. And you can imagine, that all the like that's the tip of the iceberg, the little bit of trauma that we do get to see in the records, and so that multiplied by the thousands of family members is really just incredible, literally incredible to try to imagine.
No, it is, and I guess, I mean, this is not one of the questions that I had, but I guess for you, like, how was it for you to again read all this stuff to be able to and to separate it and not take it personal?
It's a good question. I mean, it was tough. A lot of this. I have a 4-year-old son now, almost 4 years old, and so I was working on I was kind of, I don't know, finishing if the right word, but I was in the midst of writing my second book during my wife's pregnancy and then having a young son, and like, so I think that the material that was dealing with fatherhood, with child rearing, with pregnancy, with infancy, that like those things just hit differently once I became a parent. I mean, it's not like I don't want to suggest I was somehow callous to this and approach this work with some sort of like, cold, but yeah, taking breaks from this work, it's tough. And again, I'm, maybe not apparent to listeners, but if I'm on YouTube, I'm white, I'm not a descendant of enslaved people. And so, um, I can only imagine what it's like to confront this material. My black colleagues, who are descended from the people they're writing about, I would like to think I know that must hit differently. There's a whole nother layer of um, kind of the emotional toll that this work takes. And it's same thing in teaching. I mean, it's hard to teach, it's hard to talk about. Try to figure out how to write about this and talk about it without kind of leaning into the kind of pornography of violence, but also not wanting to get away from calling things what they really were and to describing them, and so to try to toe that line of sharing whatever we can get in terms of the full horror of it so that readers feel it or feel as much as they can without it becoming voyeuristic.
Mm.
It's tough, but yeah, it's tough work. I have colleagues who kind of will half jokingly, Joe, oh yeah, nice light subject, and I don't really appreciate the humor, but it's like, yeah, it's difficult. I don't know. I don't have a great answer to it other than taking breaks and stepping away. And different cases will hit you differently on different days.
No, definitely. I mean, I don't think there's, a perceived answer per se, but it
Yeah.
does, it just shows that it is, yes, heavy material to be able to look at and to, I guess, to know, like, what would anybody type of, to be able to cope reading all of this stuff and how it doesn't consume you as well. I know that that's what I found for myself in terms of reading these records, day in, day out, and you're just horrified at what you're seeing and going, oh my gosh, like this is unreal.
Yeah,
It
I
actually
feel like at
happened.
this point I've been working on the history of slavery for I don't know something like 20 years now, and like I you'd think there'd be a point where not I get numb to it, but at least I'm not surprised by the horror, and yet I still and it's not me, it's the reality of slavery. There's still the capacity of these records to shock.
Yeah.
And that's something that like when I come across a case that surprises even me, who's been immersed in this horrific, brutal world for so long, and it's like layers of just how bad it was. We come back to, and then I guess for me, there's this balance between this is kind of related
Mhm.
theme, but your question prompted me to think about it. There's a tension in kind of emphasizing enslaved or a balance between enslaved people's suffering and victimization, which I never want to kind of let go of. And also foregrounding the ways they resisted, the way they coped, they fought back, that they weren't entirely consumed by the suffering they had, and like to figure out what that balance is and not tell a kind of romanticized story which has them always resisting and succeeding, right, which can get us away from the horror and violence, but also not to write about them as if their lives are only the history of the ways they suffered at the hands of white people.
Exactly.
And that's a balance like that I continue to try to strike in my writing.
No, no, it's just being able to peel back the layers and just be able to see everything that's there as opposed to just one blanketed kind of narrative, so to speak. So, and I guess, in my next question is just that, were you able to find some of the evidence of any enslaved men using any spiritual or religious practices to cope with these emotional challenges?
The short answer is no, and I don't think that's because they weren't doing it, but simply because the spiritual beliefs and practices that really mattered in Guyana, which went under kind of over Berbice and Guyana in general, or Christianity, which was more and more, at least prominent's not the right word. Missionaries come into the colony and really start heavily trying to convert people and have some success.
Yeah.
And so enslaved people do, to a kind of limited degree, under the era of slavery, embrace Christianity. But the real big thing was a catch-all term of obeah. So it's a range of spiritual healing, harming, divination practices that kind of all get lumped under this catch-all term in Guyana and elsewhere as obeah. The issue really is that obeah was illegal in Berbice as it was in a lot of places, which meant that a lot of the practices associated with obeah had to be done in private. We see certain cases, you see kind of well-known ones when a divination case goes wrong, for example, when someone dies or where there's a large group, but those are what I don't think of as kind of everyday obeah, for lack of a better term. Those are your kind of more extreme versions, more prominent ones. That when things went well, so presumably people are invoking their deities when they have an intimate or family problem in very similar ways to how families may do so now. Um, when a partner strays or they're having a problem child rearing, presumably there's a series of rituals and beliefs associated with them. They don't show up in most of the records we have. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but I really don't know what that may have looked like in practice.
No, no, that's fine because I mean, again, phobia right now is still, yes, it's on many islands, it's still in the books, right, in terms of being illegal. And
Yeah, and even where it's legal, there's a stigma attached to it, right? Which is echoing really colonial officials and missionaries' beliefs more than really beliefs coming out of Africa that it's. I I remember my first research trip to Jamaica in like 2007 or 8. When I was trying to ask Jamaicans about obia, and there was a lot of like, who is this white American guy asking us about obia, right? And they didn't want to talk about it, but they would talk about high science, or they would talk about medicine or bush doctors, and so figuring out a way to try to get them to discuss something that otherwise they might not want to be, in part because of the stigma attached, in part because of who I am asking,
Hmm.
um, really kind of hit that home for me.
Yeah, they asked about layers around it, but not
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You just kind of synonym, and you get creative and start asking and listening, and knowing when to push and when to back off.
Hmm. Hmm. And I guess that goes to, I guess, with the colonial authorities. Like, did they make any attempts to control and, of course, to manipulate the family structures within the enslaved population?
They do, but there's a particular time when they start doing it. There's this really interesting shift that happens in the British Caribbean, which is my area of expertise, in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, in terms of how enslavers and colonial governments tried to regulate enslaved people's sexual lives and family lives. Um, for a long time, for maybe the majority of the period of slavery, at least individual slave owners, planters, plantation managers were kind of hands off in terms of enslaved people's marriages and families, basically leaving them to make their own arrangements. Now, of course, I don't say that to suggest that they're not interfering in terms of sexual abuse or separating people by sale. So it's not like they don't have an impact on family life. But in terms of who's marrying who and what arrangements they have, things like that, they really stay out of it unless it creates problems of plantation management. And so that's what you see are kind of episodic things where, hey, there's some male rivalry and someone gets poisoned or someone gets murdered, and like that creates a problem that is not about the family, but that jeopardizes plantation production. So that's really what planters care about. Starting at the end of the 18th century, though, when there's increasing attacks on the slave trade and on slavery itself, but it seems like the slave trade is going to be abolished first, and then when it is ultimately abolished, 1807, you get this whole new emphasis on really focus on enslaved people's sexual lives, on reproduction, on family life, the rise of pronatalism. And there are kind of variety of reasons for this. Part of it is planners and colonial governments and even missionaries can kind of all agree that maintaining the population, the laboring population in the West Indies, which means slave population, but some of them are even thinking towards a future after abolition, not just of the slave trade, but of slavery, that you've got to have maintain the population. Now, these are populations that have only grown or been maintained through the transatlantic slave trade. It's constant importation of African captives because planners are working people to death and replacing them. And so they see that dynamic's not going to work. And so you get this huge pressure to coerce enslaved people, incentivize, coerce them into reproducing, but also into embracing a very particular definition of family. The effects that slavery had on enslaved women and on motherhood and on family life more generally were all kind of targets of abolitionists for a very long time. They're kind of sympathetic anti-slavery I mean, literally to the physical images you see are about the suffering of enslaved women, about the supposed impact on their modesty or their virtue. And so there's this whole kind of coalescing of different forces that come together to say we've got to force enslaved people into embracing monogamy, embracing nuclear family structures, and in terms of reproducing. And you see that really clearly in the new laws that come out during this era of amelioration. Again, back to that 1826 slave code in Berbice, enslaved people not only get the legal right to marry, again, if they're Christian, it says very clearly, so they're tying marriage to this narrow version of Christian monogamy. They get the right to keep their families together, but you also see incentives to produce children, like cash rewards for married mothers. Again, mothers who had children in wedlock, and when children survived for 6 weeks. That's a recognition of how bad infant mortality was here. Um, at the same time, you see enslaved people could be punished for a range of, there's this whole long list of formal offenses that enslaved people could be punished for. Now, in practice, they're punished for essentially anything enslavers don't like. But at least the legal fiction is there's a categories of offenses, so-called domestic offenses. They include things like so-called fornication, spousal abuse, polygamy, sexual violence committed by enslaved people and other enslaved people. And so, on the one hand, this is an effort to kind of police enslaved people's domestic arrangements that didn't exist in the same way before. But what I found is the recorded rates of punishments for those offenses are remarkably low. There's a 6-month period. You have a handful of people who are punished for these things. That compares to often hundreds or thousands of people who are punished for things running away or absconding or interfering with work or not completing their work. And to me, together, that suggests that even while colonial officials and reformers started to get really interested in policing enslaved people and reproduction, individual slave owners themselves continued to be primarily concerned about things that threaten production or security. So they tended to turn a blind eye if family life is not going well, if people are kind of the way it's described in the record, seducing other men's wives, if family women are trying to leave and husbands are trying to prevent them from leaving, or vice versa. They don't really get involved. They take a kind of hands-off approach. Even during this era where the colonial government and the imperial government are saying, no, we've got to really regulate the slave family.
No, it's all about, the return on investment. They have to make sure that they're still making their money. I know
Yeah,
that
I mean, that's the big tension is like,
that's the way to
yeah,
say
and
it.
other people who've written about this in the case of Sasha Turner, in the case of Jamaica, Catherine Paul, really look at Barbados, in terms of pronatalism and focused more on enslaved women, have really highlighted the tension between seeing enslaved women, but we could extend this to enslaved fathers, and seeing enslaved people as kind of reproducers, people producing children and treating them that way, and workers. And when push comes to shove, they prefer to see them as workers. And so the things you would do to get a larger slave population through reproduction, better treatment of pregnant women, of nursing women, time off and things, they kind of make half-hearted attempts and experiments to do that. But when push comes to shove, they say, no, no, we'd rather treat them as workers. And of course, that has a real consequence on fertility and on reproduction.
Exactly. And I don't, not to go back into, the women aspect of it, but when you mentioned about the financial incentives for women to have X
Yeah.
amount of children, that was, very prominent when it came to the ending of slavery, to continue the workers, as you mentioned.
Yeah,
Now,
I mean, they see it as a crisis. I mean, once they're kind of forced to accept, or well, maybe not accept, but they're forced to deal with the abolition of the slave trade, they pivot really quickly and say, all right, what are we going to do to try to have enough people to cut the cane, to pick the coffee, pick the cotton, right? I mean, they shift really quickly to trying to grow a slave population, and it doesn't work. I mean, that's the other thing to say about all this is like pronatalism, and this is something I learned from a little bit of reading pronatalism before and after. Like these experiments generally don't work to manipulate family structures all that well, or they have very limited success, it seems like.
mhm, mhm. Now, for you, what was your, I guess, your biggest challenge in, I guess, locating these records and or personal accounts of these enslaved men in Berbice?
I was really fortunate in the case of Berbice, and this is frankly part of what drew my attention to it way back when I was early in graduate school, because the records are so much better than they are for most other places in the British Caribbean. I mean, Berbice, Demerara, Essequibo, Trinidad, and St. Lucia stand out. Um, from places like Jamaica or Barbados, the kind of most familiar, and certainly 18th century, arguably more important, certainly larger colonies. And that's because you have this extensive body of first person legal testimony from enslaved people in Guyana. These are records of legal officials known as fiscals and protectors of slaves. And the reason you have these in Guyana is kind of there are two things that come together in the early 19th century. The colony used to be Dutch, and under the Dutch, it was a legal official known as a fiscal, and enslaved people could go to the fiscal and appeal for redress. They didn't often get redress, but what happens is when the British come in, they start taking records. Well, one, they maintain the office of the fiscal as part of the terms of of treaty. So there's this kind of overlap of a British legal institution on top of this old Dutch one. And so there's a fiscal in Berbice. You don't have a fiscal in Jamaica. You don't have someone like you do later. You have the stipendiary magistrates under apprenticeship, for example. So you have a legal official who records enslaved people's complaints. Then you get amelioration, and part of amelioration has this new office known as the protector of slaves, which is going to kind of take over the fiscal's role in adjudicating complaints from enslaved people. Um, Older colonies like Barbados and Jamaica have stronger legislators, a bit more legislative autonomy, and they really resist pressure to enact ameliorative legislation that newer colonies like the Guyana colonies in Trinidad and St. Lucia that Britain acquires end of 18th century, early 19th don't. And so we get these extraordinary records, tens of thousands of pages in Guyana alone, involving thousands of different enslaved people um, complaining about various aspects of their lives. And so on the one hand, I'm really fortunate. On the other hand, these are still records that are filtered through a legal process, that's testimonies recorded by white people, that is often summarized and paraphrased. And as we know with all legal records, enslaved people who appear in court are very strategic about what they say. I mean, on the one hand, they're bringing a complaint when they think they have some chance of legal redress, and so there's a whole spectrum of things that they're not talking about. Some of the stuff we talked about earlier, I mean, aspects of their lives that don't get captured, they tend to concentrate on the things that amelioration legislation focused on. So punishment and violence, on work, excessive work, workplace disputes, and things like that. Rations, getting enough, food or allowances, so-called, of clothing. And so on the one hand, it's this incredibly rich testimony. On the other hand, people are only talking about certain aspects of their lives. And so I triangulated with all kinds of other records. But missionaries and planners, the census records, the slave registration returns, which are sort of census records, all shed different light on enslaved people's families. But in terms of, I mean, I think my answers to some of your earlier questions maybe hinted at this, the emotional dynamics and how people thought and felt about what was going on. That's a lot harder for us to understand. So even in the case of Berbice, where we probably get as close as we can to the voices of enslaved people, ordinary enslaved people, not the rare few who escaped slavery and left behind a memoir or first person autobiography. Um, Even when we get really close to what they're saying, we're getting snapshots of their lives. And in terms of family life, they tend to concentrate on areas of conflict. And so cases involving, say, domestic violence between enslaved men and enslaved women show up in the records. Um, People don't tend to go to court when things are going well, right? I mean, then as now. And so when there's a legal conflict, there's some issue, when there's some problem, that's where we get a kind of lightning bolt that illuminates the landscape. But when things were going, quote unquote, well or normal, we know much less about that.
No, and you bring up the point of the fact that you had to go to the legal records, and that's what I noticed in terms of for my own family history research is I
Mhm.
had to do more in terms of what the laws were in pertaining and being able to attack and look at those records in and of themselves. So, for family historians out there, it definitely in this period, it's definitely a lot more of the legal records after a certain point of time.
Yeah. And people don't, I mean, they don't talk about their aspirations or hopes for their families. It's like, I mean, you see them in action trying to protect, but you see them objecting to certain types of abuse. Um, you don't see as much of the day to day as you might like to. And you certainly don't see into the kind of most private, intimate moments that people are not willing to share with a white legal clerk who represents really who's there for the slave owning class.
Yeah, definitely. And then, Professor Brown, as we come to a close with this discussion, I think we could have gone on a little bit more. But, for you, how does the understanding of family lives of the enslaved men, reshape our understanding of Caribbean history and, of course, the legacy of slavery?
I think the most obvious thing, and this may not sound all that compelling, is that enslaved men were active participants in family life. They were husbands, they were fathers, forming families, having marriages mattered deeply to them. And that may sound like, well, duh, of course it did, but um, we're kind of two generations into really good scholarship on gender and slavery. We're starting to see more work on masculinity and on the gendered aspects of slavery that pertain to enslaved men. But I think for a long time there's been a way of thinking of family life under slavery and motherhood as kind of synonymous, and for good reason.
Mhm.
Um, but what I found is that fathers and husbands were key parts of this as well. In terms of legacies, I don't know. I don't know. There's a long-standing kind of myth, at least in the United States, after slavery, kind of immediately after slavery and going up through the civil rights movement, and arguably today, again, I'm not a scholar of really modern US, that sees black men as not really involved in family life, that tends to think of family life as organized around women and around mothers and grandmothers. And certainly in the era of slavery, that's not exclusively true. I don't want to take anything away from how important mothers and other women were in family life, but what I see is that men were really important too, and kind of insisting on having a role and a say, loving their dependents, trying to protect them, caring about them. And I just think culturally, we don't always go quickly to husbands and fathers. It's easy to think in terms of family life as organized around women or exclusively around women.
No, absolutely. And then, of course, just to give again, there's many aspects within this time frame period within this region. And again, this is just another layer that needs to be brought up to the forefront to say this too was still happening during this period of time as well. To thank you so much to come on to the podcast and to be able to talk about your article. And again, just appreciate your time. So thank you so much, Professor Brown.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.